Becky Pringle is nearly a household name, and not in a good way. Recently, she has made news for the anti-Semitic content her union is promoting, the attempt and backlash at trying to leave the Anti-Defamation League, and the multiple federal bills that seek to reform or de-charter her union. Yes, this is long overdue, but come meet me at the Frontline and we'll talk about President Becky Pringle and the hot, flaming dumpster fire that is her union, the National Education Association. If you are somehow unfamiliar with Becky Pringle, the only background that you really need to know is that she has been president of the nation's biggest teacher union for about 5 years. And prior to that, she spent several years as secretary-treasurer and vice president before stepping into that presidential role. And the things her union stands for are woke, radical, leftist things that are nothing but trouble. The biggest issue, though, by far, is the NEA's penchant for anti-Semitism. I'm not exactly sure when the NEA decided it would be cool to advocate against one of the most attacked and victimized groups in history, but the NEA and President Becky Pringle have made leaping bounds to do exactly that. For example, on July 18th, a group of Jewish educators came out publicly against the NEA, stating that at an official NEA event in early July, they were harassed and discriminated against, with union officials and other participants doing very little to curb the anti-Semitic actions they experienced. Coin 6, which was the local Portland, Oregon news site that was the first, I believe, to report on this, writes that, quote, in a letter to NEA's president Rebecca Pringle and executive committee on Tuesday, the organization's Jewish Affairs Caucus claimed their community was vocally mocked, harassed, and threatened throughout the 3-day convention, close quote. The article includes a few details of what this mocking looked like, but it also links directly to the letter that the caucus penned to the NEA, and I'm going to pull a few quotes from that directly so you can see exactly what Pringle is allowing, even encouraging to happen in her union. And what's so insanely ironic about this is that for a party that talks big about diversity and inclusion and acceptance and all the different facets of what that might look like, these alleged actions are some of the most hateful and rejective things to exist. So, according to the letter, Jewish delegates were repeatedly singled out by other delegates with questions like, how do you feel about the babies dying in Gaza? And do you support Israel solely because they are Jewish? As a Jewish delegate from Colorado spoke in opposition to severing ties with the ADL, she referenced the death of Karen Diamond, an 82-year-old Holocaust survivor who was burned alive by a Molotov cocktail at a peaceful demonstration in Boulder. Her recounting of this horrific death was met with laughter and clapping by some participants in the assembly. Many of the delegates exhibiting hatred towards our Jewish caucus members wore articles of clothing that bore slogans or memes and/or have become associated with anti-Israel sentiments, including verbal and physical violence against Jews. On the last day, our executive chair twice submitted points of privilege to acknowledge the 50th anniversary of our Jewish Affairs Caucus. Despite receipt of her points of privilege being confirmed, when the moment came, she was not permitted to speak. The letter then concludes with a few paragraphs and some action items that call for response from Pringle. There was one paragraph in particular that I thought was interesting and that I wanted to read in full. Quote, most unfortunate of all was how the NEA's official statement framed the situation as if U.S. classrooms were an extension of the battleground in Gaza. In trying to appear balanced, it paired anti-Semitism with vague references to anti-Palestinian bias, for which no instances were cited, as if combating anti-Semitic behavior were somehow an act of anti-Palestinian bias. Presenting human dignity as a zero-sum game is perilous for all minorities. History teaches us that when one minority is deprived of its humanity without comment, others will be too, close quote. The caucus's letter is extremely well written and highlights the issue that government unions have always struggled with, which is stepping outside of their wheelhouse in inappropriate ways. Pringle should have never allowed her union to operate this way or let the attitude of her members get this bad. And even when she attempts to address it, her actions are simply too little too late. One of the earlier points I read mentioned something called the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League. Also, in July, the NEA's Representative Assembly voted to cut ties with the group, which was founded in 1913 and is, as the name suggests, an anti-hate organization that seeks to particularly serve the population of Jewish people. On their website, the ADL calls themselves, quote, a global leader in combating anti-Semitism, countering extremism, and battling bigotry wherever and whenever it happens, close quote. So when the NEA voted to cut ties with the ADL, obviously everybody went completely mad, because the claims against the NEA from the Oregon event are not the first and will not be the last that call out the union for their bias against Jewish people. But that, coupled with the severing of ties from an organization that works to explicitly and directly combat anti-Semitism, My goodness, babe, you could not have shouted louder if you tried to. The NEA could not have been more clear with what they are trying to tell people, even when they're trying to do it without saying it directly. Our CEO, Aaron With, actually released his own statement condemning NEA's break with the ADL, and he wrote, quote, "By choosing to disassociate themselves from this country's most respected defender of American Jews and the nation of Israel, NEA leaders have laid bare their bigotry for the world to see," close quote. And to some very small degree of credit that can only be attributed to Pringle's fear in the wake of the absolutely monumental backlash she received, the NEA, after all this drama, decided to reject the proposed motion and ended up keeping its connection with the ADL, despite their members' insistence on severing the connection. So on that vein, I actually found this really interesting article when I was doing my little internet sleuthing, internet scrolling, as I do when I'm looking for articles and content to pull for these episodes. The article that I found, to be honest, is very pro-union, but it is an honest representation of what I think these union members believe. It does read like it came from the Twilight Zone, but it does shed some light on the matter that I thought was interesting in investigating this point further, like the motivations of the NEA, why they brought the motion, and why they ended up not going through with it. So this article, the author interviews a couple NEA members who were favors of the motion. It interviews the specific NEA member that brought that motion to the floor to sever ties with the ADL, and they talk about the backlash this person received, to which this person says, quote, "I had a lot of pressure on me from the executive committee. I was called in twice on the day of the resolution, and I got asked to withdraw it. I was told it was going to cause irreparable harm to the NEA," close quote. This, incredibly, is a direct quote from one of the NEA's own members. So it shows truly that they didn't reject the motion because they had a sudden come-to-Jesus moment about it and the moral implications of what they were doing, but it's because they were so terrified of the harm it would do to the union and its image. The NEA and Pringle herself have absolutely no backbone. And whatever moral compass they have, it's swayed by the magnetism of the social justice mob and whatever social justice issue is trending at that moment. I mean, I could go on and on with the examples of what the NEA is doing to deserve backlash, but before moving on to the bills that have mercifully been proposed to rein in NEA's insanity, I had a gem, just an incredible gem that I had to share that really just takes this point one step further. One of our teachers, who is an absolute champion of fighting against unions, the one and only Stacey Adair, sent me these screenshots that the NEA posted last week in preparation for the coming school year. They are what the NEA is calling, quote, "Everyone is welcome here," quote, back to school kits. And it's a collection of super rainbow and woke stickers, lanyards, bags, and more that have all this very flowery verbiage of "everyone is welcome here." The campaign, which is sponsored in a large partnership between the NEA, Planned Parenthood, and a climate change organization, says that it exists to, quote, "boldly declare our commitment to students and welcome them back to classrooms that are free from bias and welcoming to all," close quote. Come on. Do you see the irony here? It's just too good. Stacey sent me these in an email, and I laughed out loud. I could not believe it. These people, somehow the things they do still surprise me, even though they shouldn't, but this was just too good, and I had to include it. Oh, man. Anyway, now that I've had my laugh, it's due to actions just like these that the NEA has earned an especially large target on its back. A week apart, also in the middle of July, two separate pieces of legislation were introduced that focused on the NEA's federal charter in particular. So the NEA is the only government union to have received a federal charter. They are about one of 100 or so groups that get a federal charter, so the list is pretty elite. In that list of federal chartered organizations, it includes the Boy Scouts, the Red Cross, several different veteran groups, Little League Baseball, and many more. They received their charter back in 1906, and aside from the federal recognition and a few tax exemptions, getting the charter gave them a lot of recognition, but it didn't really give them any guidelines. It placed very few caveats on the NEA and what they could do or what they couldn't do, more importantly. So these two bills that were introduced focus on the charter in particular. So now addressing both bills, both have merit in how they would take down the NEA, but they do so in kind of different ways. The first piece of legislation was introduced by U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn and Representative Mark Harris, and it states a directive to fully repeal the NEA's charter. This would take away, like I said, their federal recognition, their prestige and namesake, and it would sort of punish them for using a program with notoriety to push an agenda that is, at best, absurd and at worst, completely catastrophic. The other piece of legislation was introduced by Representative Scott Fitzgerald and Senator Cynthia Lummis to overhaul the NEA's federal charter. Now, this bill in particular has some teeth to it in a really unique way. As Freedom Foundation wrote in a press release supporting this bill, we supported both bills, but in reference to this bill in particular, we wrote, quote, "The legislation titled Stopping Teachers' Unions from Damaging Education Needs Today, Student Act," how clever is that? "Was first introduced by Representative Fitzgerald in 2023 and is based on Freedom Foundation recommendations for curbing the NEA's worst practices and returning the organization to its founding mission," close quote. The Student Act would take things a step further because it promotes an avenue of installing objective transparency and accountability in the union in a totally new way. Because if left to their own devices, we know that the NEA would create a plan for transparency that's as clear as mud. So the only way to get real, truthful accountability and honesty from them is if an outside source creates the plan for them, as the Student Act would do. Among many things, the law would prohibit the NEA from engaging in electoral politics and lobbying, a restriction included in 60% of federal charters, require the NEA to submit an annual report to Congress, require the NEA to respect teachers' First Amendment rights to refrain from union membership, and subject the NEA and its affiliates to the financial transparency requirements and union democracy protections of the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act. All of these steps would be huge and frankly awesome in helping to curb the inappropriate actions of the NEA. And nearly all of the steps that the Student Act proposes were based on Freedom Foundation research and recommendations from when the act was originally proposed back in 2023. If you're curious, additional information about the NEA's federal charter and the reforms included in the Student Act, it's all available in a Freedom Foundation report that I will link in the YouTube description. The National Education Association, with the way it's being run, feels like it's almost on the verge of imploding. There's hypocrisy and anger, discrimination and threats of violence, and a union president who just sits back and lets it happen while making empty Instagram posts of the importance of having schools where all are welcome, except for Jewish people, apparently. Becky Pringle is but one union leader of many who are exacerbating this problem, and the actions of her and her union are precisely the reason why accountability needs to exist. When people are given unbridled power, it results in chaos and division in exactly the way we are seeing play out in the NEA. If you ever needed a reason to start examining and questioning the reason of having government unions around, the National Education Association is the perfect place to start. The fight for tomorrow starts today. And unions like this, like the National Education Association, are precisely the reason why we are fighting so hard. They started this battle, we are here to finish it. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The New Frontline, and we'll see you next time. Lastly, I did just want to include a quick little post-credit scene just to say that I know there were a few weeks where we didn't have any episodes coming out, and that's due to a few reasons. I got sick the first week of August, which completely took me out. I also was traveling quite a bit, both for work and for family things, which is a joy to be able to travel regularly, but it did throw a regular filming schedule out the window for a little bit. So thanks for being patient. We did have a lot of other media things coming out, so if you stay up to date on any of our social medias, we are on Twitter, or X as people call it now, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and here on YouTube as well. We have all those different social medias, so please go ahead and give us a follow. It's at Freedom Foundation or at Freedom Foundation USA on all of those handles. I also had the opportunity to travel down to Austin, Texas, so this is a little plug for an episode that will be coming out shortly, and we'll be posting it everywhere. I was able to be a guest on another organization's podcast for the first time. So if you want to know a little bit more about me, why I believe in this battle, my story of how I got here, how I found the Freedom Foundation, and why I am so passionate about this work, we include all of that as well as a few major cases that we discuss on that podcast episode. So plug for that. Keep an eye out for it. We'll be sending it out, like I said, on all social media. That's a little bit of an explanation of what's been going on. Thanks for being patient. And also, if you have any tips about stories, I mentioned a teacher, Stacey Adair, sent me some screenshots from the NEA in this episode that I used. And that is a great way. If you know of a story that is happening in your union, email us at tnf@freedomfoundation.com. We've opened up a new email for tips to come in. We are so grateful for the people that help us with our work, including Stacey Adair, like I mentioned, and it's all a team effort. That's why this battle works. And thanks for watching. That's all I had to say.